We'll discuss today a little bit about the mitzvah of moving to Eretz Yisrael. Is there a mitzvah to make Aliyah, to go to and live in the land of Israel today? Clearly the Ramban writes in Parshas Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Gimel, Pasuk Nun Gimel, and in other places as well, he learns out, Nachmanides, that there is a mitzvah chiyuvis, there is an obligation on every Jew to live in the land of Israel. That seems to be the simple pshat of the Ramban. We'll get to Rav Moshe Feinstein in a minute, who has a different explanation. But the simple reading of the Ramban is that there's a mitzvah even today to live in the land of Israel. However, Tosis at the end of Ksuvis, in Daf Kuf Yud Amid Beis, and the Mordechai in Ksuvis, they write the mitzvah Bizman Hazeh, there is no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. There once was perhaps a mitzvah chiyuvis, but Bizman Hazeh, there is no mitzvah. Why isn't there a mitzvah? So the Rishonim bring different reasons. Tosas writes, Rav Chaim HaKohen, he quotes, one is because Sakanas Drachim, it was very dangerous to get there, and therefore you'd have to risk your life, and you perhaps wouldn't even get to fulfill the mitzvah of the land of living in Israel. Hence it doesn't apply anymore. And as well as it's very difficult to keep the mitzvahs Hatchuyas Ba'aret. It's very difficult to keep the special agricultural laws that apply in the land of Israel. So that's a question that, in fact, this question was asked to Rav Moshe Feinstein in the Igros Moshe. I think it was written in the early 1950s, 1952, I believe, that he was asked the Shaila that there's a machlokas, the Ramban and the Bali Tosis of Chaim HaKohen, whether, according to Ramban, one has a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael even Bizman Hazeh, and according to Rav Chaim HaKohen there's not. They asked Rav Moshe, how do we paskin on this Shaila? One of the many Shaila V'tshuvas he wrote. So Rav Moshe writes in a classic tshuva that he thinks we paskin like the Ramban. Most follow the opinion of the Ramban that Bizman Hazeh, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael applies. The mitzvah of living in Israel still applies. However, he understands the Ramban a little differently. The way he learns the Ramban is, the Ramban holds as a mitzvah, but what he calls a mitzvah kiyumis, as opposed to a mitzvah chiyuvis. In other words, Rav Moshe holds there's no absolute obligation for one to move to Israel today to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz. However, if one does go to Eretz Yisrael, they fulfill a biblical commandment. Like we have the mitzvah of tzitzis. One is obligated to put on tzitzis when you're wearing a four-quarter garment. But if you're not wearing a four-quarter garment, you're not obligated in tzitzis, so it's a mitzvah. So if you don't wear a four-quarter garment, you're exempt from the mitzvah. But when you wear a four-quarter garment and you put tzitzis on, you fulfill a mitzvah min Torah. So that's what Rav Moshe writes. Similar, there's no mitzvah you have to live in Israel, but if you do, it's a big merit. You fulfill a biblical mitzvah. And in fact, the Vilna Gaon and others have something similar by regarding the mitzvah of Pesach, because there seems to be an apparent contradiction in the psukim. On one hand, it says the mitzvah is be'erev tochlu matzos. The mitzvah is the first night of Pesach. Yet it also says Shiva Yomim. It's the 7 days you eat matzah. So which one is it? So the Vilna Gaon writes that the Chiyav is the first day, the first 2 days of Chutz La'aretz, but the rest of Pesach, even though there's no Chiyav to have matzah, but if you have matzah, one fulfills the mitzvah min haTorah. That's why different reasons why people are machmi are strict to eat shmura matzah the whole Pesach. Either, different pshatim in the Rambam, whether it's required the whole Pesach, or like the Vilna Gaon says, that there's a mitzvah kiyumis the whole Pesach. That's what Rav Moshe writes. We passing like the Ramban, but the Ramban sheet there's no absolute obligation, only a condition of mitzvah kiyumis. And in fact, one of his rayas is he wants to say the Rambam also, Maimonides, who we'll get to in a second, who omits the mitzvah, and there's a lot of discussion on why he omits the mitzvah, but the Rambam omits the mitzvah in Hilchas Malachim, Perek Hey Halacha Tes. He quotes the issue of leaving Eretz Yisrael. However, he does not write that it's usher for a Jew to reside outside the land of Israel. So Rav Moshe writes, if there's an absolute obligation for a Jew to live in Eretz Yisrael, so one would conclude that it is prohibited to live outside. In fact, the Rambam doesn't write. It's like there's an Isser to live in Egypt. He should write there's an Isser to live in Chutzar. Since he does, he says Mutta Lishchon Bechol Olam Chutz Mitzrayim. So we see the Rambam holds as well. There must not be an absolute obligation to live in Israel, or else it wouldn't be permitted to live outside of Israel. So either way, and therefore he concludes that the pshat in the Ramban is that there's no absolute obligation. That's the pshat in the and as well. Plus we have Rav Chaim Kohen who's concerned about fulfilling the mitzvah. So together with both, he says it's a mitzvah kiyumis, and therefore if you go to Eretz Yisrael, you fulfill a mitzvah min haTorah. But if you don't, you do not violate. You are an avarian. That's the opinion of Rav Moshe. The Tzitz Eliezer, among others, and Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, Zatzal used to be the chief rabbi at Shari Tzedek in Yerushalayim. He has a much different approach in terms of he takes in this whole nationalistic aspect. In other words, it's interesting when Moshe wrote the Tshuva in the early 1950s, and he didn't make any distinction post 1948, pre-1940. 1948, we got the state of Israel under Jewish control. So Rav Moshe doesn't seem to make a distinction whether the mitzvah doesn't apply any more or less. It's a mitzvah, and therefore, with the fact that we have the state of Israel under Jewish control, it might be a good thing, but it's nothing that doesn't affect the mitzvahs. According to the way Rav Moshe seems to learn, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is like the mitzvah of Tefillin, like the mitzvah of Matzah. You do the mitzvah, it's like any other biblical obligation. In this case, Rav Moshe is considered to the mitzvah of Tzitzis and to the mitzvah of Matzah, because he holds it's a mitzvah kiyumis. And in fact, we'll see what. So another thing, Rav Elzer Waldenberg seems to take in. He seems to say that it's a fundamental, it's a central mitzvah. In fact, that seems to be a fundamental mitzvah. A fundamental mitzvah among the poskim about whether today, even if you assume there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, is it a fundamental mitzvah like any other? There's in Thinking Aloud, the sefer that someone wrote about the Rav Soloveitchik. So in the chapter on Eretz Yisrael, there are different versions, but he quotes one version from Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, from the Soloveitchik dynasty, and he writes, he says, I'm going to retire from, when I get older, I'm going to retire. This is what his mother, I think he says his mother used to tell him, or used to tell his mother, that when I retire from Brisk, I'm going to move to Eretz Yisrael, I'll plant some trees, and then I'll fulfill my mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. In other words, he felt it was like any other mitzvah, nothing special. Other places, there's different ways of quoting the story. That no, he felt it was more than just a regular mitzvah. So either way, so Ramosha doesn't, whether he holds it or not, at least in this tshuva, he doesn't point out any distinction, the fact that we have the mitzvah, that we have Israel and the Jewish. Rabbi Waldenberg does take that into account as well. And it makes even a bigger mitzvah, the fact that now, today it's a fundamental mitzvah, it's under Jewish control, and all the Jews have to move here now. So Rabbi Waldenberg holds like the Ramban, that it's a mitzvah, but he says the Ramban, it's a mitzvah chiyuvis. And in fact, that's the opinion also as well. Rav Schechter as well feels that certain every generation has the certain mitzvahs, and the fact that we have Eretz Yisrael today, that takes on, it's one of our major mitzvahs. But we'll see. We'll get back to that. So there's a whole discussion in what the Shitas HaRambam is, because the Rambam omits the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't count it. So there's many different explanations why doesn't Rambam count it. So on one hand, you have the famous answer of the Megillas Esther. The Megillas Esther, not the Megillas Esther we read on Purim, it's a sefer on the Rambam, and I think it's named after his mother. It wasn't a woman who wrote it. I think he named the sefer after his mother Esther, and he writes that the Rambam doesn't list this mitzvah as a big chiddush, because this mitzvah only implies during the biblical times, and as well only during the time of Yemos HaMashiach. So the Megillas Esther says the Rambam leaves it out because he holds there is no mitzvah b'zman hazeh. There's no mitzvah, the mitzvah of living in Israel doesn't apply again into the time of Mashiach. In fact, this is the cornerstone of the Shitas of the Satmar Rebbe, based on the Gemara at the end of Ksuvis, about it's not time, we can't take over Eretz Yisrael by force, and we have to wait for the Mashiach, we have to wait till God gives us. So that's the Satmar Rebbe Shita, based on the Megillas Esther, that the Rambam leaves it out because there is no mitzvah. It's interesting, on that note, the Meshach Chochmah writes that after the League of Nations endorsed the Balfour Declaration, therefore gave us the right to move back in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, he disagrees on that point, that it's not considered, that it's considered taking it by force. Either way, that's the Megillas Esther's part and the Rambam. You have others who hold, the Stei Chemed quotes that perhaps the Rambam only holds it's a mitzvah midrabanan. That's why it was left out. And you have the Avnei Nezer who takes the other side of the coin and says that the Rambam holds like the Ramban, it's a mitzvah min HaTorah. It's a mitzvah min HaTorah. So why does the Rambam leave it out? Because the Rambam tells us in his principles elsewhere that he only counts a mitzvah once. So where else did he count this mitzvah? So the Avnei Nezer suggests he counted it, he counted it where? He counted it in the mitzvah of Hachreim Tachreim, when the Jews enter the land of Israel, they have to throw out the 7 nations, or what's the mitzvah? Throw out the 7 nations and then move to New York, move to LA, move to Toronto. No, the mitzvah is obviously to throw them out and live there. The Avnei Nezer says he included in the mitzvah of throwing out the 7 nations. So within the Rambam, you have the whole gamut. According to the Megillas Esther, there's no mitzvah at all today until Yemos HaMashiach. According to the Stei Chemed, he quotes that there's only a mitzvah midrabanan today, and you have the Avnei Nezer who holds it's a mitzvah min HaTorah. So we had on one hand, we had the sheet of the Ramban that holds Pashtus, it's a mitzvah chiyuvis, it's an absolute obligation, and that tells somewhere in the Rambam. Rav Moshe holds we pass like the Ramban, but he says it's only a mitzvah kiyumis, it's a mitzvah deraisa if you move there, but you don't have an obligation like tzitzis, like matzah. And you have the Rav Chaim HaKohen and the Bali Tosas who say there is no mitzvah to to live in Eretz Yisrael today. So even if you assume, so that's the whole discussion among the Rishonim, Achronim, and the different Heterim. Obviously, if you can't make a living in Eretz Yisrael, as the Gemara says in Shabbos, Asay Shabbat Chaskol Atzistarach Labrios, it's better to eat weekday food on Shabbos than to rely on charity. So if you can't make a living, you can't find a Rabbi, so therefore they're Heterim. However, just to conclude, even if you assume that there's no obligation, Bizman Hazeh, we still have to realize about the great schus of having Eretz Yisrael, and in fact, as the Gemara tells us at the end of Ksuvas, as we'll get into more, that if one spouse refuses to move to Eretz Yisrael, that's enough to warrant a divorce and to lose the Ksuva. Or we see this, the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Chesam and Beis, that we permit it if you want to buy land in Eretz Yisrael, we even permit Amir L'Nachri to tell a guy to write the document on Shabbos, and as to conclude, as they quote, as Rav Jafter quotes Rav Aaron Lichtenstein at the end, and he says he heard from him directly, but he says that just like a Jew will find it difficult to live without Kedushas Hazman, i.e., live without a Yontif, to live without a Shabbos, so too we should find it difficult to live without Kedushas Hamakam. So even if we, if we can't live there, and there are many people who can't, for whether it's finding a Shidduch, finding a Rebbe, for Parnasa, but as well we should realize that living in Eretz Yisrael is the ideal, and we should keep that in mind. As Rav Shach always quotes from Rav Yeshua Leib Diskin, that by Eved Ivri, that why is it that in Eved Ivri he's punished, he steals and he's punished, so you pierce his ear, the ear that heard on Har Sinai not to steal, or the ear that heard don't become slaves. So the question is, when do you do this piercing the ear? After 6 years, if he decides to stay, a hafti es adoni. The question is, why now? It should have been done right away. Why give a onish 6 years later? So the Maharal Diskin explains, because obviously, really the slavery was the onish. You become a slave, you don't control your own destiny, that's the punishment. But if you're taking the punishment and you're making it into a reward, that means you never got a punishment. So therefore, God has to give you another punishment, and therefore, after 6 years you realize that you want to be a free person, so then obviously you don't need to do nirtzav. If you turn an onesh into a punishment, so then unfortunately God might have to give another onesh. So too, Rav Shach says here, that we have to realize the Chastei Hashem, we have to realize we were put in Golus because of our sins. And now that we have an opportunity to live in Eretz Yisrael, or at least go to Eretz Yisrael, so therefore we don't want to say, oh well, who needs Eretz Yisrael? The Golus is so good. We don't want to make the mistake of the Eved Ivri, and we have to be aware of the tremendous Chastei Hashem that He gave us Eretz Yisrael, and as well in 1967 we were zocheh to get back Yerushalayim as well, and now we have access to the holiest place in the world by the Kotel Hamaravi. And as always, before there's a mitzvah of Olarego, and that's a discussion whether Bizman Hazeh, if there's still an Inyan, even though there might not be a mitzvah in our Torah of Olarego today, but some say there's still an Inyan. Anyway, Bizman Hazeh, if you can make it to Eretz Yisrael, you can make it to Yerushalayim for the Shalosh Rekolim, so there's an Inyan as well there. Is Yom Yerushalayim. So maybe we'll discuss some Inyane Eretz Yisrael and Inyane Yerushalayim. There's a Mishnah at the end of Ksuvas, Daf Kuf Yud, or somewhere around there, talks about Kol Malin Eretz Yisrael. everyone goes up to Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah is talking in the context of husband and wife in terms of the ksuva. We know for the Ramban in Parashas Maseh, the Ramban writes that there's a mitzvah min Torah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That the Horashtam Osam Yeshavstam Ba Pasuk of Parashas Maseh, he says it's a chiyuv min Torah, an absolute obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Chaim HaKohen in Tosas and Ksubis over here, he writes, Bisman Hazeh, in our day it no longer applies anymore. We no longer have a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because of either Sakanas Derachim, the dangers of travel, the pirates, and all that kind of things, and as well as the difficulty in keeping the mitzvahs Hatkuyas Ba'aretz, the difficulty in keeping Trumas, Meiser, Shemitah, etc. So, and then the Avnei Nezer, who lived, 100 years ago, so he claims, those reasons don't apply anymore. Even Tosas would be Modeh in our generation, that you would have a chiyuv, but that's the Avnei Nezer's pshat. But Tosas writes that Rav Chaim HaKohen said no mitzvah. In fact, that's the famous tshuva of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe is a tshuva in 1952. He was asked, how do we paskin? Like the Ramban or Rav Chaim HaKohen. Is there a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael today or not? Because the Ramban says yes, the Rav Chaim HaKohen says no. So he concludes, he thinks the consensus view is like the Ramban. However, he learns the Ramban a little differently. Many learn the Ramban that it's an absolute obligation. Just like there's a mitzvah of putting on tefillin, there's a mitzvah of eating matzah, whatever the mitzvah is, it's an absolute obligation. And therefore everyone has an obligation to move to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Moshe says that's not the pshat in the Ramban, and that's not the pshat in the Rambam. The Rambam's a whole discussion. What is the Rambam Shita? Because Rav Moshe writes that Bisman Hazeh, the Ramban would agree what he calls a mitzvah kiyumis, not a mitzvah chiyuvis. In other words, Rav Moshe's modeh, if one moved to Eretz Yisrael and lived there, he fulfill a mitzvah da'araisa of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. However, one who does not go is not an avaryan. You're not mevatel mitzvahs aseh. There is no aseh. It's kind of like the mitzvah of tzitzis. If you're wearing a four-cornered garment, you chayav to put on tzitzis. But if you're not wearing a four-cornered garment, then you don't have a mitzvah. Or perhaps like the Vilna Gaon writes by matzah, that on one hand the Torah tells us the chiyuv matzah is the first night, the erev tochu matzah, perhaps the first 2 nights in Chutz La'aretz, and yet we say Shiva, the Torah says 7 days we'll eat matzah. So which one is it? 1 or 7? So the Vilna Gaon and others have a different shot in the Rambam, the Briskers. That the chiyuv, the matzah is the first night, or the first 2 nights. But the rest of Pesach, whenever you eat matzah, you fulfill a kiyuv mitzvah daraisa of achilas matzah. So that's why one of the reasons why people are machmer to eat shmura matzah the whole Pesach, based on this gra of doing the kiyuv mitzvah as well. Some say the Briskers are machmer because of the Rambam. That maybe, depending how you learn the Rambam, maybe he holds you to eat shmura matzah for the whole Pesach. Whatever it is, that's what the Grush is showed, and others, and the Tziv has something as well, that there is this concept of kiyum ha-mitzvah versus a mitzvah chiyuvah. So that's what Rav Moshe's famous tshuva, that he says it's a mitzvah deraisa to go, but there's no obligation. And he says that's the Rambam Shita also. Even though the Rambam writes that it's also to leave Eretz Yisrael, but he says but it's not prohibited for someone to live in Chutz La'aretz. In fact, that's what he writes by Egypt. He writes, you can live Kol Haaretz Shav, you can live anywhere in the world except for Mitzrayim. Implying, obviously it's L'shitasa that he doesn't hold. If he held there's a mitzvah chiyuv, it's a living in Eretz Yisrael. How could you live in? So therefore, that's where Moshe's shita that it's a mitzvah kiyumis. So that's the Mishnah in Ksubis. That Kol Ma'alin Eretz Yisrael. Pashas, because the mitzvah of Yishav Eretz Yisrael, the context is that it says who's responsible for breaking up the ksuva, breaking up the marriage. My nafkamina, is the husband obligated to pay the ksuva? If he's responsible, so the Gemara says, like the Mishnah says like this: if he wants to go to Israel and she doesn't, she's considered responsible for breaking up the marriage. If she wants to go and he doesn't want to go, he's responsible for breaking up the marriage. My nafkamina kofano so lahose ksuva. Well, or whether she loses the ksuva. If she's responsible, then she doesn't get the ksuva, the money of the ksuva. But if he's responsible, he would. So that's what the context over there is. They can each force one another to move to Eretz Yisrael. The pashtus is based on the mitzvah of Yishav Eretz Yisrael, which we explained the Shitas Ramban and Tosas, and the Rambam is the whole gamut. The Rambam Shita, see, the Rambam doesn't count it. So either he doesn't count it, so some say he doesn't count it because there is no mitzvah. That's the famous shot of the Megillah Esther, not the one we read on Purim. And she wasn't a mafarish on the Rambam. He named it after his mother, Megillah Esther, and he writes, and this is the cornerstone of the Satmar Shita, that the mitzvah only applies during biblical times and messianic times. And now we have no right to take over Eretz Yisrael by force, and therefore, that's why the Satmar Rebbe, based on the Megillah Esther, I'm sure he has a whole divrei yo on many sources, why there is no mitzvah of Yishav Eretz Yisrael now won't apply until the Yemos HaMashiach. So that's a separate share in its own right, going through, the Megillah Esther, the Kashas on and that. Then you have others who say the Sdei Chema brings down, the Rambam holds it's a mitzvah midrabanan, but the Avnei Nezer says no, the Rambam agrees to the Ramban. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa, so if they agree, so how come the Rambam doesn't write it? Because you have to know the Rambam writes in his kolam, in his shoresh, that he doesn't count. When you have two mitzvahs coming for the same purpose, he only counts one mitzvah. So what are the mitzvahs does the Rambam count that there's no need to count Yishav Eretz Yisrael? So the Rambam counts the mitzvah of Hachreim Tachreim, that when the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael, the mitzvah was to throw out this Zayin Amamim, the 7 nations that lived there. So what was the mitzvah? Throw them out, and you move back to Toronto, you move back to LA, you move back. Obviously the mitzvah is to throw them out, and you should move in. But the Rambam already counts it under Hachreim Tachreim. He already counts it under another source, hence there's no need for the Rambam to spell it out again. So either way, so fundamentally, Avnei Nezer says the Rambam and the Ramban are in agreement. There's an absolute obligation today to move to Eretz Yisrael. Of course, like any rule, there are exceptions to the rule in terms of parnasa, making a living, finding a shidduch, finding a Rabbi, all the important things in life. Because what's the pshat? You have to be able to live a normal life. What's a normal life? Having a Rabbi, finding the right wife, and having a parnasa. See, that's why those are 3 exceptions to the rule. Barring that, then if you hold like the Ramban and Avnei Nezer, you'd have an absolute obligation. Avnei Nezer has the whole truth, but how come all the Hasidic Rebbeim didn't move? If there is a mitzvah, that's a separate share. So either way, that's the Mishnah. So the problem is it's hard to say that because the Mishnah continues and says, but who adin? Let's say you lived in Tel Aviv. I'm making up the places, but let's say someone husband and wife lived in Tel Aviv, Haifa, what have you, and one spouse wanted to move to Yerushalayim, and the other didn't. So who's responsible for breaking up the marriage? So the Mishnah says the same thing. If you want to move to Yerushalayim, you're responsible. So there's no mitzvah to live in Yerushalayim. Bishloma, the mitzvah of Yishav Eretz Yisrael we could discuss. But there's no special mitzvah. There might be more kedusha. We could get into why it might be a good thing to live in Yerushalayim. But what's the pshat in the Mishnah then? Like, how could you force someone? Bishloma, they're not doing a mitzvah, because then the shaila is, it can't just be the mitzvah anyway, because as Rabbi Tukachansky, who was in the Sefer Era Kodesh Mikdash or something like that, he wrote a lot of stuff on Eretz Yisrael, and he asked him, like, what does that mean anyway? Let's say husband wants to learn in Kolel, wife says no, like Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. So how come we don't have that halacha? That if I want to learn in Kolel, but she's responsible. So obviously the one that's more than even the mitzvah. The one it can't be the mitzvah, because what about Yerushalayim? And why not other mitzvahs? So he says, he had very interesting pshat in the Mishnah. So he says, this halacha in general, let's say hypothetically, purely hypothetical, any characters mentioned are purely coincidental. Let's say the husband lived in Toronto and the wife came from Cleveland. Obviously no one lives in Cleveland. That's a hypothetical, right? And let's assume the England. No. So let's go. And let's say the husband says he demands we live in Toronto, and she says Cleveland, and she's responsible for breaking up the marriage. If they both lived in Cleveland, and then he wanted to go somewhere else, then I think then it's okay. Because what's the reason? Because Almanas Kain Nasa. It was built in, it was understood. Again, if today it's not, obviously, barring any, if you made, usually that's something usually going to be discussed, but barring any, assuming you went out, you never discussed anything about then that's the assumption. Obviously, when you work out different arrangements, it's not going to be. But that's not, you don't have to live in your homeland, in your hometown, but if that's what you want, so that's built in. So there's an interesting discussion, like, I think it's Rabbi Tam Shita, about, let's say, there's a discussion in the Rishonim, let's say, it's not, if someone lives in, LA and someone lives in Toronto, wherever the places is, it's a question whether, according to some Rishonim, could she force you to live in, if you both lived in a whole town, could she force you to live? So according to some Rishonim, no. In other words, some Rishonim say that Allah only applies to Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim, but doesn't apply, it's not the same halacha in terms of, let's say, LA or Toronto. So, so what's the pshat? The pshat is, let's say, Cleveland, Toronto might be your own personal town, but Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, that's every Jew's hometown. So it takes on a different status. He goes on to say, that's what the Mishnah is saying. The Mishnah is not, in other words, the Mishnah is talking in the context of marriage, and that's pshat Rav Chaim HaKohen, he says. I quoted you Rav Chaim HaKohen, Bisman Hazeh, he writes, there is no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because it's Sakanas Drachim. So he asks a very good kasha. He says, what does that mean? Bisman Hazeh is no. So, okay, so what is he saying? So he should say, you're chayiv to live in Israel, but you're an honest, so you can't. But what do you mean doesn't apply? Like, what's the language? Because the Sakanas Drachim, there's no mitzvah? Who says there's no mitzvah? The same mitzvah still exists. I just can't live. So what's the language? So that's what he says. So he wants to claim, Rav Chaim HaKohen is not saying there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. He's not talking, he's giving a very interesting pshat. The pshat, everyone learns Rav Chaim HaKohen saying it is, but his pshat is no. Rav Chaim HaKohen is not talking about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That he could hope still applies. He's talking about the mitzvah vis-a-vis the halachas of marriage. He's saying the halacha about kol malay Yisrael, about kol fenoso hotzi ksuva, bizman hazeh doesn't apply anymore. Why? Because the sakanas drachim, or the difficulty of mitzvahs. In other words, you can't say almanas kein nasa anymore. Because of the dangers and because of the difficulty of keeping the mitzvahs, that assumption no longer applies. And that's what he's saying is in terms of kol fenoso, but he's not discussing, but he wants to say, of course he holds as a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Like why should, so you're an honest, but why should the mitzvah, you're not going to get punished for not keeping it, but maybe fundamentally agrees with the Rambam and the Ramban. He's just saying else, he's just saying regarding the din of Wahotzi also Biksuva, because there's no reason for him, or else he would have had a totally different language. That's his whole pshat al manaz kein nasa, that the whole halacha of this din is because to live in it's every Jew's home is to live in in the Jewish homeland, and that's the pshat in the Mishnah in Ksubis. It's not out the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Even if there wasn't, there's still out it's your own homeland. The halacha that you're chayiv to live there. And then Rav Chaim Cohen's pshat is not taking away the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. He's just saying vis-a-vis this halacha doesn't apply. So just to conclude that one thing. So there's an interesting Maral Diskin by Evet Ivri that he says why is it that Evet Ivri gets, if he decides to stay, he gets nirtza. So Pashas, it's an onish that either the heir that heard on Har Sinai not to steal, or the heir that heard on Har Sinai, there can't be slaves. You went ahead and you stole. So Pashas, it's an onish. So the question is, if it's an onish, why is it happening 6 years later? You should have got the onish right away. So what's the pshat? You have the kasha? You should have did it. Nirtz is a punishment for stealing, so why are you punishing him 6 years later? You should do nirtz year one. So the Mara of Diskin answers, because really the onish is supposed to be the avdus. Really, the punishment was that you're supposed to be a slave. You don't control your own destiny. You can't function anymore. Like Shawshank Redemption, the guy who came out of jail and he didn't know how to survive in society. It's the ultimate curse. You're an eved. You can't do anything on your own. But obviously, if you took the onish and you turned it into a reward, ahapti said, "Oh, this is great here. Wow, I don't have to worry. No responsibilities." Whatever, if he has steak, he has to give me steak, I get the pillows. This is great here, I don't want to leave. Okay, then you missed the whole essence of it. Now you need nirtza. So similarly, as we say in our davening, because of our sins we are sent into Golus. And we know with Chasdei Hashem we have a very comfortable Golus at the moment. No guarantees, but hoping it will continue. But when people start thinking Golus is the ideal, that this is the way it should be, if the punishment becomes the schar, then one has to be careful that we don't get another onish isn't coming. But that's what Rav Shecht always like saying over in terms of that. And then to conclude on Yom Yerushalayim, that if there's a Gemara in the end of Tainus about the happiest days of the year, one is Tu B'Av. And there are many things that happen on Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av. But one of them was, Hoshea ben Elah, I believe his name was, removed the guards off the road that Yerovam and Nevat put, that they stopped the Jews from going to Be'ola Rego. And he removed it, and he gave them an option. No one forced them to go, but they had a right to. So some want to say, homiletically, so if the mere opening of the gates, so to speak, the roads to Yerushalayim was a reason for a quasi-yantif, Tu B'Av, how much more so when we get the actual Yerushalayim, the Kotel HaMarabi, the holiest place holiest place in the world today, how much more so it should be a day of simcha and joy, of mixes yontiv. Again, whether you say halal or not, and all the other halal, halal is a halachic issue we're not going to go into now, but the fact that now, since before 1967, people could go, but people were shooting at you. I was speaking to someone who actually was pre-48. He said people still used to went to the kotel, but it was much more dangerous. In 1967, we took over the kotel Hamaravi. So if mere access to Yerushalayim was a reason to make a simcha, so too how much more so when we got back to Yerushalayim, and now the Chasdei Hashem gave it back to us, to have some demarcation at it's a special day, and we should have some, make some type of, quasi have a minimally have a barbecue and have a Sudas Haudah. But I'll leave it to you to decide how you're gonna make that day special.